The champagne flute felt heavier in my hand than it should have. Crystal stemware from the Palmer House ballroom, probably worth more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Around me, 300 of Chicago's finest pretended to care about the Youth Arts Fund while actually caring about who wore what designer dress and which judge's wife had the newest facelift. I'm Kellan Brooks, federal prosecutor for 18 years, which means I've gotten good at reading rooms full of liars. Tonight, I was surrounded by them, but only one mattered. My wife Maren glided across the marble floor in her emerald silk gown, the one that cost $3,000 according to the credit card statement I'd memorized. She moved like she owned the place, which wasn't surprising since her father, Judge Theodore Hollis, practically did own half the people here through favors and legal decisions. "Kellan, darling, come meet someone wonderful." Maren's voice carried that particular pitch she used when performing for an audience. Her hand found my elbow with practiced ease, guiding me toward a man I'd been watching all evening. Rhett Vossin stood 6'2" with the kind of tan you only get from spending other people's money in warm places. His handshake was firm, his smile was perfect, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone always working an angle. "Rhett's been my dance partner for the waltz lessons," Maren announced to the small circle of society wives who'd gathered to witness whatever performance she had planned. "He's absolutely divine on his feet." The ladies tittered appreciatively. Judge Hollis beamed with paternal pride. I stood there holding Maren's coat and purse like a well-trained assistant. Then Maren delivered her line. "Honestly, ladies, this is the man I should have married." She gazed up at Rhett with theatrical adoration. "Look at those shoulders. And he actually knows how to lead on the dance floor." The laughter erupted around us. Sharp, knowing laughter from women who'd spent decades perfecting the art of the social cut. A few glanced at me with something between pity and amusement. I'd been waiting 11 weeks for this moment. Ever since I'd found the first bank statement hidden in her jewelry box. Ever since I'd discovered the credit cards in her maiden name. Ever since I'd realized that my wife of 7 years had been living a completely separate financial life. I raised my champagne flute. The conversations around us continued, but something in my posture must have caught attention because the circle gradually fell quiet. "To new beginnings," I said. My voice carried without shouting, a skill you develop after years of addressing federal judges. "May your next husband enjoy paying off the $200,000 in debt you hid from me." The silence spread outward like ripples in a pond. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. The string quartet in the corner seemed to falter for a moment before continuing their Mozart. Maren's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then recognition, then something approaching panic. Judge Hollis stepped forward, his face flushed. "Kellan, what on earth are you—" The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers. The sound of shattering glass on marble cut through the ballroom like a gunshot. 300 heads turned toward our little drama. 200,000, I repeated, looking directly at Maren. "That's the current total across 4 credit cards, 2 personal loans, and 1 line of credit. All in the name Maren Vance, your mother's maiden name, in case anyone's wondering why I didn't know about it." Rhett took a step back. Smart man. "The interesting part," I continued, "isn't the debt itself. It's what the money bought. Art authentication services, shipping costs to offshore auction houses, and consulting fees to experts who specialize in creating very convincing forgeries." Mrs. Patterson, the foundation's treasurer, made a small choking sound. She'd purchased 3 pieces from Maren's gallery in the past year. Judge Hollis found his voice. "This is hardly the time or place for private marital—" "Private?" I looked around the ballroom. "Nothing about this has been private, Your Honor. The gallery sales, the authentication certificates, the pieces sold to your own family foundation, all very public transactions." Maren finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kellan, please. Not here." "Where then?" I asked. In our bedroom, where you've been lying to me for 2 years? In your office, where you've been certifying forgeries as originals? Or maybe in whatever hotel room you and Rhett have been using for your business meetings? The crowd had formed a proper circle around us now. This was better than any charity auction for entertainment value. Nola Varrow pushed through the crowd. Maren's best friend since college, the woman who'd been maid of honor at our wedding. She looked pale and shaky. I need to talk to you, she said to me, ignoring everyone else. Not here, at the bar. I looked at Maren one more time. 7 years of marriage, and I was seeing her clearly for the first time. The desperation in her eyes wasn't about our relationship. It was about exposure. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I told the crowd. I'm sure you'll have plenty to discuss. I followed Nola toward the bar, leaving Maren standing in the center of a circle of Chicago's social elite, her perfect evening crumbling around her like the fragments of her father's champagne flute. The bartender, a professional who'd probably seen every kind of drama wealthy people could manufacture, poured 2 whiskeys without being asked. She promised me 20%, Nola said without preamble. I handled the shipping, the paperwork, the buyer introductions, 2 years of work, and I never saw $1. I sipped the whiskey. Good stuff. Probably cost more per ounce than most people's hourly wage. What do you want to know? Nola asked. Everything, I thought. But I started with the obvious question. How long has she been working with Rhett? 18 months, maybe longer. He needed money for his gambling problem. She needed someone with connections to private collectors who don't ask too many questions. Gambling? Atlantic City mostly. Some online poker. His wife thinks he's been traveling for work. Nola laughed bitterly. Maren's been financing his addiction with debt in your name. I thought about the credit card statements I'd found, the cash advances, the balance transfers. It all made sense now. The art pieces, I said. How did she choose the targets? Family first. Your grandmother's collection was the easiest. Dementia made the substitutions invisible, then the foundation pieces. Her father's connections made those sales look legitimate. My grandmother, the woman who'd raised me after my parents passed away. Maren had been stealing from a 90-year-old woman with Alzheimer's. I have documentation, Nola continued. Shipping records, authentication certificates she forged, email chains with the forgers. I kept everything because I knew this would eventually collapse. Why tell me now? Because I'm not going down with her ship. The gallery's been asking questions. The foundation hired an independent appraiser. It's all about to come out anyway. I finished my whiskey and looked back toward the crowd. Maren was surrounded by concerned friends and family, probably spinning some story about marital problems and misunderstandings. Judge Hollis was working the room, trying to contain the damage. There's something else, Nola said. She's been planning to leave. There's a passport in her maiden name, bank accounts you don't know about. She's been preparing an exit strategy. Of course she had been. Maren never did anything without a backup plan. When? I asked. Soon. Maybe this week. The gallery's starting an internal audit. She knows time is running out. I thanked Nola and walked back toward the crowd. The evening was winding down, but the real drama was just beginning. Tomorrow I'd start making phone calls. To the FBI's art crime unit. To the gallery's board of directors. To Rhett's wife. But tonight, I wanted to go home and look through our wedding photos. I wanted to see if I could spot the moment when the woman I'd married had decided to become someone else entirely. Maren appeared at my elbow as I collected my coat from the check. We need to talk, she said. Yes, I agreed. We do. The drive home passed in complete silence. Maren stared out the passenger window at the Chicago skyline while I navigated the late-night traffic. Our Lincoln Park townhouse sat dark and imposing when we pulled into the driveway, like a monument to everything we'd built together and everything she'd been tearing down behind my back. Inside, Maren kicked off her heels and headed straight for the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of wine with hands that shook slightly. The confident socialite from the Gala had been replaced by someone who looked cornered. "How long have you known?" she asked. I loosened my tie and took a seat at our granite kitchen island. The same island where we'd shared breakfast every morning for 7 years, where she'd kissed me goodbye before heading to her gallery, where she'd planned her deception while I'd planned our future. 11 weeks, I said, since I found the first credit card statement in your jewelry box. You went through my things? I was looking for your grandmother's ring, the one you said you wanted to have reset for our anniversary. I studied her face. Except it wasn't there because you sold it 6 months ago, didn't you? Maren's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. The forensic accountant I hired is very thorough, I continued. Patricia Chen. She specializes in financial fraud cases. It took her 3 weeks to trace all the accounts tied to Maren Vance. You hired an investigator? I'm a federal prosecutor, Maren. When I find evidence of fraud, I investigate. It's what I do. She set down the wine glass and faced me directly for the first time since we'd gotten home. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she said. The first piece was just an opportunity. Mrs. Wellington wanted to sell her Monet, but she needed authentication. I knew someone who could create the paperwork for a reproduction while I arranged a private sale of the original. Mrs. Wellington from your book club? The widow with Parkinson's? She needed the money for medical expenses. I helped her get top dollar for the piece. By selling her a forgery and keeping the original? Maren's cheeks flushed. She got what she needed. The buyer got a beautiful piece. Everyone was happy. Everyone except the buyer, who paid $300,000 for a fake. It's a very good fake. I stared at her. This was the woman I'd married, the woman I'd trusted with my finances, my future, my grandmother's care. When did Rhett get involved? I asked. About a year later. He understood the high-end collector market. He had connections I needed. He had gambling debts he needed you to cover. Maren's silence confirmed what Nola had told me. The foundation pieces, I said. Those were your father's connections. The foundation has an extensive collection. Some pieces haven't been displayed in years. No one would notice if a few were updated. Updated? That's what you call stealing from a children's charity? The foundation still has beautiful art. The children still get their programs. The only difference is that you've committed multiple felonies while destroying your father's reputation and stealing from sick elderly women. Maren stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked our back garden. In the moonlight, I could see the reflection of tears on her cheeks. You don't understand the pressure, she said. The gallery, the social expectations, keeping up with everyone else. Do you know what it costs to maintain the life we have? The life you wanted, I corrected. I was happy with our old apartment. You wanted Lincoln Park. I was happy with my Honda. You wanted the BMW. I was happy eating dinner at home. You wanted to join every club and charity board in the city. I wanted us to matter. I wanted us to be important. So you decided to finance it with fraud. She turned back to me, and for a moment, I saw something like the woman I'd married. Vulnerable, scared, real. What happens now? She asked. I'd been thinking about that question for 11 weeks. As a federal prosecutor, I had clear ethical obligations. As a husband, the situation was more complicated. Tomorrow I call the FBI, I said. I turn over Patricia's financial analysis and Nola's documentation. They'll start a formal investigation. Nola gave you documentation? She kept records of everything. Shipping manifests, authentication certificates, email chains with the forgers. She's been preparing to distance herself from your operation for months. Maren sank into the chair across from me. My father will have to recuse himself from any related cases. His judicial career is effectively over. 30 years on the bench, and he'll be remembered as the judge whose daughter ran a forgery ring using his connections. I never meant for him to get hurt. But you knew he would. The moment you started selling fake pieces to the foundation, you knew this would destroy him if it came out. We sat in silence for several minutes. The kitchen clock ticked toward midnight. In a few hours, the phone calls would start. The investigation would begin. Our life together would officially end. "There's something else," I said. "The passport in your maiden name. The bank accounts, I don't know about. Were you planning to tell me before you left, or was I supposed to figure it out when I came home to an empty house?" Maren's face went pale. "How did you—" "Patricia's very thorough. She found the accounts, the passport application, the apartment lease in Boston, under Maren Vance, of course. I needed options. You needed an escape plan. Can you blame me? I knew this would eventually come out. I knew you'd react exactly like this." "Like what? Like someone who's been lied to and stolen from for 2 years? Like a prosecutor instead of a husband?" I considered that. Maybe she was right. Maybe another husband would have confronted her privately, tried to work something out, protected the family reputation. But I wasn't another husband. I was someone who'd spent 18 years putting criminals in prison, and my wife had just confessed to being one of them. "Pack a bag," I said. "Stay at your father's house tonight. Tomorrow, hire a criminal defense attorney. A good one. Kellan, this conversation is over, Maren. Anything else you want to tell me, tell your lawyer." She stood slowly, like someone much older than her 38 years. At the kitchen doorway, she paused. "I did love you," she said. "That part was real." "No," I replied. "That part was the biggest lie of all." After she left, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of our life together. The wine glasses from our honeymoon in Tuscany, the coffee maker she'd insisted we needed even though we both preferred tea, the granite countertops that had cost more than most people's cars. Tomorrow, I'd start dismantling everything we'd built. But tonight, I poured myself a drink and began planning exactly how I was going to make sure Maren Vance faced consequences for every lie, every theft, every moment she'd spent destroying the lives of people who'd trusted her. Starting with a phone call to Rhett's wife. I made the first call at 7:30 the next morning. Sandra Vossin answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. I'd met her twice at charity functions, a successful real estate attorney with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she didn't miss much. "Mrs. Vossin, this is Kellan Brooks. We've met at a few gallery events." "Of course, Maren's husband. What can I do for you?" "I think you should know that your husband has been having an affair with my wife for the past 18 months. She's been financing his gambling addiction with money stolen through art fraud." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "I see," she said finally. "Do you have proof?" I liked Sandra Vossin. "Extensive documentation, financial records, photographs, witness statements. I'm turning everything over to the FBI this morning, but I thought you deserved to know first." "I appreciate that. Can you send me copies of the relevant materials? My attorney will contact yours by end of business today." "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. This explains quite a few things." She hung up without another word. Within an hour, she'd filed for emergency divorce proceedings and frozen all joint accounts. By noon, she'd changed the locks on their penthouse and had Rhett's belongings delivered to his office. My second call went to Patricia Chen. "The wife confessed last night," I told her. "I need you to prepare a comprehensive report for the FBI. Everything we've found, plus anything new you can dig up." "I've been working on that since you hired me," Patricia said. "There are more victims than we initially thought, at least 12 private collectors, plus the foundation. Total damages are approaching $2 million. $2 million. I sat down hard in my desk chair. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "I traced some of the offshore accounts. Your wife's been moving money to banks in Portugal and Switzerland. She's been planning this exit strategy for over a year." "How much?" "About $400,000 in accessible funds. Enough to disappear comfortably." I thought about Maren's confession the night before. Her claims that it had started small, that she'd never meant for it to go so far. More lies. "Send everything to Agent Morrison at the FBI's Art Crime Unit," I said. "I'll call him this morning." My third call was to the gallery where Maren worked. The director, James Patterson, had been expecting to hear from me. "The board met in emergency session this morning," he said. "We're conducting a full audit of every piece Maren authenticated in the past 3 years. We've also suspended her pending the outcome of the investigation." "How bad is it?" "Potentially catastrophic. If even half the pieces she certified are forgeries, we're looking at lawsuits, insurance claims, and complete loss of credibility. The gallery might not survive this." 47 people worked at that gallery. Curators, administrators, security guards, maintenance staff. All of them would lose their jobs because of Maren's greed. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "So are we all." By afternoon, the story had leaked to the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Federal Prosecutor's Wife Suspected in Art Fraud Ring." The article was careful with its language, lots of alleged and suspected, but the damage was immediate and severe. Judge Hollis called me at 4 o'clock. "Kellan, we need to talk." "No, Your Honor, we don't. You need to talk to your daughter's attorney. She's family. She's a criminal who used your reputation to commit fraud. If you contact me again about this case, I'll report it to the Judicial Ethics Committee." I hung up and immediately called the Ethics Committee myself. Judge Hollis would be forced to recuse himself from any related cases, and his entire judicial record would be reviewed for potential conflicts of interest. A 30-year career reduced to a footnote about nepotism and corruption. That evening, I drove to my grandmother's assisted living facility. Rose Brooks, 91 years old, had raised me after my parents were lost in a car accident when I was 12. She'd sacrificed her retirement savings to put me through law school. She'd been so proud when I married Maren, so happy to finally have a granddaughter. "Hello, sweetheart," she said when I walked into her room. The Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she rarely recognized me, but today was a good day. "Hi, Grandma. How are you feeling?" "Oh, you know, old and tired, but the nurses here are lovely." I looked around her room. The walls that had once been covered with family photos and her collection of small paintings were now mostly bare. I'd assumed she'd put the pieces in storage when she moved to the facility. "Grandma, what happened to your paintings, the ones from your apartment?" "Oh, that sweet girl took them for safekeeping. Maren, is it? Your wife. She said they'd be safer in a proper gallery than here." My chest tightened. "When did she take them?" "Oh, months ago, maybe longer. Time gets funny when you're old." I spent another hour with her, listening to stories I'd heard 100 times before, pretending everything was normal. When I left, I sat in my car in the parking lot and finally let myself feel the full weight of what Maren had done. She hadn't just stolen money or art. She'd stolen from a confused elderly woman who'd trusted her. She'd stolen from children's charities. She'd stolen from friends and colleagues and strangers who'd believed in her expertise. And she'd stolen from me. Not just money, but 7 years of my life. 7 years of believing I was married to someone who didn't exist. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. R. Rhett." Apparently, Sandra's divorce filing had gotten his attention. I typed back, "No, we don't. I can make this easier for everyone. Meet me at Murphy's Pub on Clark Street, 1 hour." I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I forwarded it to Patricia Chen and Agent Morrison. If Rhett wanted to talk, they'd want to hear every word. Murphy's Pub was the kind of place that catered to off-duty cops and courthouse staff. Dark wood, cheap beer, and conversations that stayed private. Rhett was waiting in a back booth, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down. "I'm here because my attorney advised me to hear what you have to say. This conversation is being recorded." Rhett's face went pale. You can't. I'm a federal prosecutor meeting with a suspect in an ongoing investigation. I can record anything I want. He ordered a whiskey. I stuck with coffee. Look, he said, this whole thing got out of hand. It started as a favor to help a few people sell some art pieces. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. Tell that to my 91-year-old grandmother. I didn't know about her. That was all Maren. But you knew about the forgeries. You knew about the fake authentication certificates. You knew about the foundation pieces. Rhett drained his whiskey and signaled for another. I needed the money. You have no idea what it's like to owe people who don't accept payment plans. So you decided to finance your gambling addiction by helping my wife commit fraud. It wasn't supposed to go on this long. I was going to pay back everything once I got ahead. Gamblers never get ahead, Rhett. That's why they're called addicts. He leaned forward, desperation clear in his eyes. I can help you. I can testify against Maren, provide evidence, whatever you need. Just help me work something out with the prosecutors. I am the prosecutor. You know what I mean? Put in a good word. Tell them I cooperated. I finished my coffee and stood up. Here's some free legal advice. Hire an attorney, a good one. Because when this goes to trial, you're going to need all the help you can get. I left him sitting in the booth, staring at his whiskey like it might provide answers. Outside, the Chicago evening was crisp and clear. For the first time in 11 weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. Tomorrow, the FBI would begin making arrests. The gallery would continue its audit. The victims would start filing lawsuits. Judge Hollis would face ethics charges. Rhett Vossin would take Rhett for everything he had left, and Maren would discover that her carefully planned escape route had been blocked by someone who understood the legal system better than she did. I walked home through Lincoln Park, past the townhouse that would soon be sold to pay restitution to her victims, past the life we'd built on a foundation of lies. But for the first time since finding that credit card statement, I wasn't walking alone. I was walking toward something new, something honest, something that belonged entirely to me. The FBI arrested Maren at O'Hare International Airport at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. She was attempting to board a flight to Lisbon under the name Maren Vance, carrying a suitcase full of cash and a passport that had cost her $5,000 from a forger in Detroit. Agent Morrison called me from the airport. We got her. She had $47,000 in cash plus jewelry and art pieces worth about $200,000. She was planning to access the offshore accounts once she reached Portugal. What's the charge? For now, passport fraud and money laundering. The art fraud charges will come later, once we finish documenting all the victims. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the Tribune's coverage of the investigation. The headline read, "Gallery Director Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Art Fraud." Below that, a smaller story. Judge Hollis recuses himself amid ethics investigation. My phone had been ringing all morning. Reporters, colleagues, friends who just heard the news. I'd stopped answering after the 5th call. At 9 a.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Nola Varrow standing on my front steps, looking nervous and exhausted. "I need to talk to you," she said when I opened the door. "The FBI will want to interview you as a witness. You should have an attorney present." "I know, I've already hired one. But there's something else. Something I didn't tell you at the gala." I led her into the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch like she might need to run at any moment. "Maren wasn't working alone," she said. "There's someone else. Someone who's been coordinating the forgery operation from the beginning." "Who?" "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. She runs the authentication lab that most of the major galleries use. She's been providing fake certificates for years, not just for Maren." I knew Dr. Hartwell by reputation. She was considered one of the top art authentication experts in the Midwest. Museums and collectors trusted her completely. "How do you know this?" "I delivered pieces to her lab personally." I saw the setup, legitimate equipment for real authentication, but also a separate workspace where they create false documentation. She's been running a parallel business for high-end forgeries. Why didn't you tell me this before? Nola's hands shook as she reached for her purse. Because I was scared. Dr. Hartwell has connections everywhere. She authenticates pieces for the Art Institute, the Field Museum, private collectors worth hundreds of millions. If she goes down, she's taking a lot of people with her. Including you. Including me. She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to me. These are copies of everything I kept. Shipping records, email chains, payment receipts, enough to prove that Dr. Hartwell was the center of the operation. I opened the envelope and scanned the documents. Email conversations between Maren and Dr. Hartwell discussing special projects. Invoices for authentication services that cost 10 times the normal rate. Shipping records showing pieces being sent to the lab and returned with new documentation. There's something else, Nola said. Dr. Hartwell has been blackmailing some of her clients, collectors who bought pieces knowing they might be forgeries. She's been demanding ongoing payments to keep their secrets. Extortion on top of fraud. She calls it insurance premiums. I thought about the scope of what Nola was describing. This wasn't just my wife's desperate scheme to finance a lifestyle she couldn't afford. This was an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. I need to call Agent Morrison, I said. There's one more thing. Nola's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Judge Hollis isn't just a victim. He's been taking payments from Dr. Hartwell for years. Cases that involved art authentication, custody disputes over valuable collections, estate settlements. He's been steering business to her lab in exchange for money. The room went quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Judge Theodore Hollis, 30 years on the bench, pillar of the legal community, Maren's father, a criminal. How do you know this? Maren told me. She was proud of it, actually. Said her father had been facilitating business relationships long before she got involved. Do you have proof? Some. Bank records showing payments from Dr. Hartwell's accounts to accounts controlled by the judge. Not enough to prove bribery in court, but enough to start an investigation. I walked to the window and looked out at the street where I'd lived for 7 years. The life I'd thought I understood was disappearing piece by piece, replaced by something much darker and more complicated. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I want immunity, full immunity in exchange for cooperation, and because... She paused, seeming to gather courage. Because Maren said you were too stupid to figure out how deep this really went. She said you'd focus on her and Rhett and never look at the bigger picture. Even in custody, even facing federal charges, Maren was still underestimating me. I called Agent Morrison and arranged for Nola to be interviewed that afternoon. Then I called Patricia Chen and asked her to expand her investigation to include Dr. Hartwell and Judge Hollis. This is going to be huge, Patricia said. If Dr. Hartwell's been running authentication fraud for years, we're talking about hundreds of victims and tens of millions in damages. How long to put together a case? With Nola's cooperation, maybe 6 months? But Kellan, you need to be careful. If Judge Hollis is involved, he's going to fight back. He has connections throughout the legal system. Let him fight. I've been prosecuting corruption cases for 18 years. I know how this works. That afternoon, while Nola was being interviewed by the FBI, I drove to the federal courthouse. I had a meeting with the U.S. attorney to discuss my role in the investigation. Since my wife was a defendant, I'd have to recuse myself from any direct prosecution, but I could still provide guidance and analysis. U.S. Attorney Margaret Walsh was a no-nonsense prosecutor who'd built her career on high-profile corruption cases. She listened to my summary of the evidence without interruption. This is going to be the biggest art fraud case in Illinois history, she said when I finished. Possibly the biggest in the country. Are you prepared for what that means? I think so. Your wife, your father-in-law, your social circle, your marriage. All of it's going to be dissected in public. The media attention will be intense. Your personal life will become evidence. I understand. Do you? Because once we start this, there's no going back. No plea deals that keep family secrets private. No quiet resolutions. We're going to prosecute everyone involved to the fullest extent of the law. I thought about my grandmother, confused and trusting, handing over her life's collection to someone she thought was family. I thought about the children's charity that had been robbed to finance gambling debts. I thought about all the collectors who'd been sold forgeries, all the legitimate dealers whose reputations would be damaged by association. Good, I said. That's exactly what I want. That evening, I sat in my empty house and opened a bottle of wine, a good bottle that Maren had been saving for a special occasion. I poured a glass and toasted the empty room. To justice, I said aloud, and to new beginnings. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, full of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, trusting that the institutions around them were honest and fair. Tomorrow, I'd help make sure that trust was a little more justified. But tonight, I was just a man whose wife had tried to destroy everything he believed in, and who decided to fight back. 6 months later, the trials began. The media had dubbed it the Chicago art scandal, and every major news outlet had reporters camped outside the federal courthouse. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell was the first to go to trial, facing 47 counts of fraud, money laundering, and extortion. The evidence Nola had provided, combined with the FBI's investigation, painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade. I watched from the gallery as the prosecution presented their case. Patricia Chen had done exceptional work tracing the financial networks. Agent Morrison had built an airtight case. Dr. Hartwell's defense attorney tried to argue that she was simply providing services that collectors wanted, but the jury wasn't buying it. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Dr. Hartwell was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Judge Hollis was next. The ethics investigation had uncovered a pattern of judicial corruption spanning 20 years. Cases involving art authentication, estate disputes, and custody battles where valuable collections were at stake. In each case, Judge Hollis had steered business toward Dr. Hartwell's lab in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. The judicial corruption trial was more complex, involving questions of legal precedent and constitutional law. But the financial evidence was clear, and Nola's testimony was devastating. Judge Hollis was convicted of bribery, conspiracy, and abuse of office. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and stripped of his judicial pension. Rhett Vossin pled guilty to conspiracy and money laundering in exchange for a reduced sentence. He testified against Maren, providing details about their affair and the gambling debts that had motivated his involvement. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the victims, which brought us to Maren's trial. I sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery every day, watching my wife of 7 years face the consequences of her choices. She'd hired an expensive defense team, but there was no realistic defense against the mountain of evidence. Financial records, authentication certificates, victim testimony, Rhett's cooperation, Nola's documentation. It was overwhelming. The prosecution painted her as the mastermind of the scheme, the person who had identified vulnerable victims and coordinated the forgeries. They showed the jury photos of my grandmother's empty apartment, financial records showing the theft from the children's charity, testimony from collectors who'd trusted her expertise. Maren's defense team tried to portray her as a victim herself, manipulated by Dr. Hartwell, pressured by social expectations, driven to desperation by financial stress. They argued that she'd been in over her head, that she'd never intended for the scheme to grow so large. On the final day of testimony, Maren took the stand in her own defense. She wore a simple blue dress and minimal makeup, trying to project vulnerability and remorse. Her attorney walked her through a carefully rehearsed story of gradual corruption, claiming that Dr. Hartwell had gradually drawn her into the scheme through small favors and increasing pressure. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was trying to help people sell their art, and it just got out of control." The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. They walked her through each victim, each forged certificate, each stolen piece. They showed her the financial records proving she'd been planning her escape for over a year. They confronted her with evidence of her affair with Rhett and the gambling debts she'd been financing. "Mrs. Brooks," the prosecutor said, "you've testified that you never meant for anyone to get hurt, but you stole from your husband's 91-year-old grandmother, a woman with Alzheimer's who trusted you completely. How do you reconcile that with your claim of good intentions?" Maren's composure finally cracked. "She doesn't even remember those paintings. They were just sitting in storage, not helping anyone. So you decided to help yourself to them?" "I was going to pay her back." "With what money? The money you stole from the children's charity? The money you got from selling forgeries to collectors who trusted your expertise?" The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Maren guilty on all 32 counts: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, elder abuse, and theft. The judge sentenced her to 18 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all victims. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, Maren looked back at me one final time. I saw no remorse in her eyes, no regret for what she'd done to her victims or her family. I saw only anger that her carefully constructed plan had failed. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the Chicago afternoon. Reporters shouted questions, but I ignored them. I had nothing more to say about Maren Vance or the woman I'd thought I'd married. Patricia Chen was waiting for me at the bottom of the courthouse steps. "It's over," she said. "Yes, it is." "What will you do now?" I looked up at the federal courthouse where I'd spent so much of my career, where I'd learned to seek justice and hold criminals accountable, where I'd just watched my wife be sentenced to 18 years in prison. "I'm moving to Portland," I said. "Lewis and Clark Law School offered me a position teaching trial advocacy. I think I'd like to help train the next generation of prosecutors." "That sounds like a good fresh start." "Yes, it does." That evening, I sat in my empty townhouse. Empty because everything of value had been sold to pay restitution to Maren's victims. I opened a bottle of champagne, the same brand that Judge Hollis had been drinking the night I'd exposed his daughter's crimes. I poured one glass and let it sit on the kitchen counter, watching the bubbles rise and disappear. Some toasts, I'd learned, were better left unfinished. Outside, Chicago continued its life without me. Tomorrow, I'd finish packing. Next week, I'd drive to Portland and begin again. But tonight, I was exactly where I needed to be, alone, honest, and free from the lies that had defined my marriage. The champagne went flat while I sat there, thinking about justice and consequence and the price of trusting the wrong person. When I finally poured it down the drain, I felt lighter than I had in years. Some endings, I realized, were actually beginnings in disguise.